So my location this week is the CANAL boathouse at Polworth, which sadly has seen better days and I think is on its way out now. But I want to combine this view with some boats which are over here. So I'm going to begin with one of these mixed media pieces. And really what I'm hoping to demonstrate in the video is how you might and how I might translate these patterned and textured papers that I'll be using for the mixed media demonstration, for the study, how to translate those into oil paint. So I'm highly challenged here. I've got plenty of blue paper, but I haven't got any green paper. And there's an awful lot of green here, so this is good because this is what it's all about, this mixed media approach, that it's working with a degree of chance, so that the process of making a drawing or a painting is one where you deal with accident and where you make discoveries, where you respond intuitively to the whole process. So I'm putting down a couple of big areas. I want to cover the white of my paper. So I've got something that's probably a bit sky-like, and I've got something for a bit of water. So I'll put them down and then go on to some smaller shapes. So I think this is improvising big style, because I really haven't got many of the colours and even perhaps interesting textures I would have liked. So I have to make do, and I'm hoping that that will generate some really interesting additions to what I might have got otherwise. So I'm just including some of the other view with the boats under the tree and squeezing that in. So lots of room for improvisation. So I have one bit of green. I want to get in here because it's really lovely when the sun comes out. You get some very bright colours in the reeds. So let me get some of that in there, and then it may be that that's as far as I can go collage wise. Some bits of green up here as well. So I'm happy that I've got some of the big shapes, but I'm going to have to do a lot of the colour and the textures with my pastel. So I added a couple more bits of paper at the bottom because I saw that the sky was reflected in the water. And actually this is another location where you find that the longer you spend here, actually the more it's apparent there's plenty going on. So I've had ducks and boats, so I may well add other things to my composition, but what I want to do first is the next stage of this mixed media process is to introduce some ink, some ink lines to start to bring out some of the description of my subject. My ink isn't flowing very well. So it's, as I described previously, working with the collage shapes So that's really giving you a structure. Tearing them means that they're not precise, and what comes next is a refining of those shapes. But having to set down something fairly loose and bold is always very useful. So there's a lot I'm going to leave out here, and I'm also, as I've said, combining a couple of views. So I want to turn that into that view of the boat. So I'll do a bit more with the ink and then show you what I want to do with the pastel. And at any point I can start to add other shapes. I can collage shapes on top and introduce other content to my composition. So my ink is nearly dry, and I'm going to start putting on some oil pastels. Now I think it would be quite tempting at this stage to feel, oh, it's just not working. And I think for me it's partly not working because I didn't really have enough green. Actually, some green bits of paper would have made a big difference, but it will work. And what I have to do to make it work is to carry on getting in some of these big shapes. So I'm going to do that. I think, because the green is the thing that's missing, I'm going to get down some large areas of green oil pastel. I've still got my basic underlying structure of the torn bits of paper, but I think to get a bit more of these missing colours, but to do it to do it with large areas, I think will make the difference. I think that already makes a lot of difference. So, as I said, there's a lot of activity around here actually, and I may well add some extra bits of collage. There have been boats and there have been ducks, and that sort of thing may contribute to my composition. And it's great when the sun comes out. It's a whole different experience. So I've had to work quite hard to get I think a sense of light actually, which is what I'm interested in, because I've combined these different views. Got a lot of oil pastel on, the light's changing and so on. There goes a boat. So why isn't that part of my picture? It's probably what I need, somewhere through the middle. But that's as much as I want to do with this part of the demonstration, because I think what's more useful will be looking at how to translate that into oil paint. So back in the studio, I want to demonstrate how to translate this mixed media study into a piece of oil painting. I'm working on a white canvas board, and in a way emulating what I was doing with my first bits of collage paper, I'm just going to put down a couple of large areas of some pale blue for my sky, and then some of the brown area that I'd used in the mixed media piece. I had some brown paper which I'd stuck down. So in that way I'm getting the white surface covered. The paint's not too thick, and I'm going to therefore have a wet surface to work into, but it's going to be one of different colours and it's not going to be white. Some more of that covered. Now, I did say that when I was doing my study at the boathouse, I didn't have terribly exciting papers. I had a bit of map at the top and a bit of brown paper at the bottom. But I could at this point, if I was thinking about some of the patterns that are in the map, it might be quite nice to modify these areas already. You know, I could put in a bit of variation, just, you know, make some patterns, really, which could be inspired by the particular collage paper. And if I just work that in wet, that might be a good way to start. Then what I'm going to do, because my next stage with the mixed media piece was to put down this piece of cream coloured paper for the boathouse with its red roof, I'm just going to wipe away an area for that with a rag, and I've pre-mixed that colour, which is going to represent my bit of paper. Maybe it could have been a bit lighter, but because I've wiped away with the rag, I'm not going to have too much trouble with paint mixing. So if I'm concerned about things muddying, I'm not going to get that much mixing yet, and that's just going to allow me to put down some of the initial shapes. I did also put down some blue shapes for the boat, so let me do that next. So I put a couple of boats over here, and again I'm wiping away some of the wet paint just so I can minimise the mixing at this point. So really in this stage I'm just showing you how you might be able to emulate what you do with torn paper and collage, just by covering the canvas with some of the main areas of colour. And again, that's the structure, that's going to hold the whole painting together. I didn't, while I was out, have very much or almost any green. So maybe since that's quite important, I'm going to do the same thing. Having laid down some of that sky, I'm just going to wipe some areas. I mean, the wet paint that I put down, that I'm wanting to work into, isn't very wet, but I can minimise some of that mixing by wiping away. And so again, I can be dealing with just quite large areas. I want to have a bit of green here. So, you know, a real feature of this mixed media approach is putting down these shapes and then gradually adding definition, and hopefully being able to exploit interesting papers, surprising colours, and so on. But I think what's a feature of working wet in wet is it's possible to also get surprises from the way that the paint mixes. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is how you might control that mixing. even from the very start. I think for areas like the water, to have the paint mix quite extensively is pretty good, because that's what reflections are like. They're soft. It's perhaps more when you're trying to control the mixing with some of the sharper contrasts that there's a different kind of challenge, which I'll come on to next. So I wasn't delighted with my composition. I think I didn't spend enough time looking around and choosing my most interesting viewpoint. What I did come to the conclusion was that my painting really was going to be about light. And I think to achieve some of that effect, I really needed to get in some of the darks, looking against the sky, against the light, at some of these dark trees. So I've done most of the painting so far with, I think it's maybe a number 6 brush, so it's all fairly broad, because I'm still in a way working with these larger shapes, and I'm just trying to get in some of the cool dark of these leaves against the light. And I've also got a warm dark, just a bit of brown, which I'm putting on with a thinner brush. That's a number 3. And so without wanting to get too fiddly, I do want to get these narrower, warm dark tree trunks. So everything is wet and is mixing, but I'm not worrying too much about that at this stage, because I think actually it's not that wet. I rubbed a lot of the paint in at the beginning, you saw, and so it's fairly easy to control that. Because I'm working wet in wet, I'm not actually emulating that stage where I applied ink lines to the mixed media drawing. I could do that, but I think what I would have to do is stop at this point and let these coloured shapes dry, and then I could take a thin brush and introduce a whole series of lines. But what I'm going to do instead is do as much as I can with the wet paint, and I will be demonstrating floating the paint so that I can get more definition or brighter colours, more contrast into a wet surface. And I'll take that as far as I can, but then I'll allow it to dry before introducing a final layer of, again, brighter colours, definition and contrast. So this is a gradual process of breaking up these initial shapes, and I suppose looking at some of the patterns of my subject, all the archways in the boathouse, for example, but not using lines really, apart from painting the tree trunks, which were linear to a certain extent, but gradually introducing these smaller and smaller shapes. And as I say, when I'm dealing with reflections, the fact that things mix is perfectly good. What I want to gradually work towards, because I'm interested in the light, is bringing out some of these lighter areas. I want to take a clean bit of light paint and paint it into a wet surface. I'm going to get mixing. So then I have to start trying to manage that mixing, control that mixing. And that can be done partly by floating the paint. So I've got plenty of paint mixed on my palette. I pick it up on the tip of my brush and I hold my brush almost parallel to the painting so that I can sit it on the surface and minimize the amount of mixing. That principle in a way is easier if I start using bits of card, because I'll really imprint that paint on the surface even more substantially. So for example here, if I want to get on this brighter bit of colour, which is the kind of sign on the boathouse, and I've mixed up plenty of the brighter colour, laying it, imprinting it using the piece of card, so that sits on the surface and really stands out. And because it's a sign, it's a fairly kind of geometric bit of subject matter, and even the straight edges of the card can help quite a bit. I imagine that would work very well as I start to bring out some of the archways of the boathouse. So I'm introducing some of that light contrast in the same way, imprinting some of the lighter colour using the bits of card. But I'm probably jumping ahead of myself a little bit, because one consequence of working like this, or a feature of this way of working, is that the paint is thick, and it would probably be worth waiting a bit before getting into the thicker paint, because once the paint gets thick it can be harder to manage the mixing. Once I've floated it on the surface, fair enough, I've got the effect on after, but I can't really work with it. So it's the sort of thing that's worth doing at a later stage. But I do think it helps, it certainly helps me to have some notes, some top notes to do with light and colour. And I quite like to establish some of those lighter and brighter areas early on. So I wouldn't do it everywhere, but if I can have, as I say, a kind of top note of some of the lightest and the brightest colours, then that helps with the whole direction of the painting. So this is what I'm doing now. I'm just putting in one or two brighter, lighter areas. And I'm using the card as a way of floating things on, so that I've got a feeling for the full contrast from those darks, those warm and cool darks, all the way through to some of these lighter and brighter colours. So I'm continuing to work with painting shapes and just testing out some of the mixtures to see where I want brighter colour, where I want lighter contrast or more emphasis, and making note of the things that are muddying and mixing, that I will restate when the surface is a bit drier, and I'll restate it partly by being able to work on a dry surface, and also partly by doing the things I've described of floating the paint and making it sit on the surface of the canvas so that the mixing is less pronounced. And I'm trying also to think in terms of the different sorts of marks that I'm making, reflecting either the subject matter, what's the surface of the water, this kind of broken, rippling, softened texture, or it might even be something that's been inspired by the papers I used when I made the mixed media collage. So there may well have been maps and wrapping papers and this sort of thing. And that I can do at the very early stage as I work with not so much paint, staining the surface of the canvas and eliminating some of the white, or I could do it at the later stage when I'm floating finer details and patterns on the much drier surface. So I think that's probably all I can do in the way that I've described. I think there are linear things I would like to do, which I would like to do with a fine brush on a dry surface, and there are smaller bits of definition that I'd like to introduce using card and mainly the card really. So I decided there were 3 more things I wanted to do. I'm just darkening that roof because I wanted to get some light on the end of the roof. Ended up with a kind of pink pastel, which wasn't necessarily exactly the colour I wanted, but it seemed to work quite well. So that seems to be something worth introducing to my painted version. The second thing I wanted to do was to introduce some lines, some edges to these archways. I think it's worth me trying that while the paint is wet and just seeing what's possible and returning to it when the painting's a bit drier in order to supplement those darker bits of contrast. But it's often, with this sort of linear definition, I think it's quite good when things don't come out too sharply, because I think that's a more subtle and natural or believable effect. And I wanted to put some similarly linear definition on these boats. So I suppose some of these marks, which in my mixed media piece were done with ink, I'm now actually, done with black ink. I'm now actually making colours which are appropriate to that particular part of the painting. Blues for the boat and brown for the boathouse and so on. So that's all I'm going to do, and I'll just add a little bit onto the video with the final things that I did that I'm going to do when the paint's a bit drier, which will be tomorrow.